Hey guys, Jordan Barclay here. I'm just going to do a little something different with this audiobook, and hopefully I might do this for the rest of the audiobooks to avoid all these copyright strikes I've been getting. So I'm gonna record audiobooks just the same. I got an even better mic over here, but I'll have to be webcamming myself, and I'll put a screenshot of what I'm reading right over here. But you know, for people who just want to listen to the audiobook, feel free to switch the tab or whatever. You know what to do. You've done this before. Alright, with that being said, I'm gonna stop talking, and today we will be doing a short story. Hi guys! A Real Durwan by Jhumpa Lahiri. Read by me, Jordan Barclay. Because I want to. Alright, let's dive in. Borima, sweeper of the stairwell, had not slept in 2 nights. So the morning before the 3rd night, she shook the mites out of her bedding. She shook the quilts once underneath the letter boxes where she lived, then once again at the mouth of the alley, causing the crows who were feeding on vegetable peels to scatter in several directions. As she started up the 4 flights to the roof, Borima kept one hand placed over the knee that swelled at the start of every rainy season. That meant that her bucket, quilts, and the bundle of reeds which served as her broom all had to be braced under one arm. Lately, Borima had been thinking that the stairs were getting steeper. Climbing them felt more like climbing a ladder than a staircase. She was 64 years old, with hair in a knot no longer than a walnut, and she looked almost as narrow from the front as she did from the side. In fact, the only thing that appeared three-dimensional about Borima was her voice, brittle with sorrows, as tart as curds, and shrill enough to grate meat from a coconut. It was with this voice that she enumerated, twice a day as she swept the stairwell, the details of her plight and losses suffered since her deportation to Calcutta after partition. At that time, she maintained, the turmoil had separated her from a husband, 4 daughters, a 2-story brick house, a rosewood almari, and a number of coffer boxes whose skeleton keys she still wore, along with her savings, tied to the free end of her sari. Aside from her hardships, the other thing Borima liked to chronicle was easier times, and so, by the time she reached the 2nd floor landing, she had already drawn to the whole building's attention the menu of her 3rd daughter's wedding night. We married her to a school principal. The rice was cooked in rosewater. The mayor was invited. Everybody washed their fingers in pewter bowls. Here she paused, evened out her breath, and readjusted the supplies under her arm. She took the opportunity also to chase a cockroach out of the banister poles, then continued. Mustard prawns were steamed in banana leaves. Not a delicacy was spared. Not that this was an extravagance for us. At our house, we ate goat twice a week. We had a pond on our property, full of fish. By now, Borima could see some light from the roof spilling into the stairwell, and though it was only 8 o'clock, the sun was already strong enough to warm the last of the cement steps under her feet. It was a very old building, the kind with bathwater that still had to be stored in drums, windows without glass, and privy scaffolds made of bricks. A man came to pick our dates and guavas. Another clipped hibiscus. Yes, there I tasted life. Here I eat my dinner from a rice pot. At this point in the recital, Borima's ears started to burn. A pain chewed through her swollen knee. Have I mentioned that I crossed the border with just 2 bracelets on my wrist? Yet there was a day when my feet touched nothing but marble. Believe me. Don't believe me. Such comforts you could not even dream them. Whether there was any truth to Borima's litanies, no one could be sure. For one thing, every day, the perimeters of her former estate seemed to double, as did the contents of her almari and coffer boxes. No one doubted she was a refugee. The accent in her Bengali made that clear. Still, the residents of this particular flat building could not reconcile Borima's claims to prior wealth alongside the more likely account of how she crossed the East Bengal border, with the thousands of others, on the back of a truck, between sacks of hemp. And yet there were days when Boy Ma insisted that she had come to Calcutta on a bullock cart. Which was it, by truck or by cart? The children sometimes asked her on their way to play cops and robbers in the alley. To which Boy Ma would reply, shaking the free end of her sari so that the skeleton keys rattled. Why demand specifics? Why scrape lime from a betel leaf? Believe me. Don't believe me. My life is composed of such griefs you cannot even dream them. So she garbled facts. She contradicted herself. She embellished almost everything. But her rants were so persuasive, her fretting so vivid, that it was not so easy to dismiss her. What kind of landowner ended up sweeping stairs? That was what Mr. Dalal on the third floor always wondered as he passed Boy Ma on his way to and from the office, where he filled receipts for a wholesale distributor of rubber tubes, pipes, and valve fittings in the plumbing district of College Street. Betre, she probably construct tales as a way of mourning the loss of her family, was the collective surmise of most of the wives. And Boy Ma's mouth is full of ashes, but she is the victim of changing times, was the refrain of old Mr. Chatterjee. He had neither strayed from his balcony, nor opened a newspaper since independence. But in spite of this fact, or maybe because of it, his opinions were always highly esteemed. The theory eventually circulated that Boy Ma had once worked as hired help for a prosperous zamindar back east, and was therefore capable of exaggerating her past at such elaborate lengths and heights. Her throaty impostures hurt no one. All agreed that she was a superb entertainer. In exchange for her lodging below the letter boxes, Boy Ma kept their crooked stairwell spotlessly clean. Most of all, the residents liked that Boy Ma, who slept each night beside the collapsible gate, stood guard between them and the outside world. No one in this particular flat building owned much worth stealing. The second floor window, Mrs. Misra, was the only one with a telephone. Still, the residents were thankful that Boy Ma patrolled activities in the alley, screened the itinerant peddlers who came to sell combs and shawls from door to door, was able to summon a rickshaw at a moment's calling, and could, with a few slaps of her broom, rout any suspicious character who strayed into the area in order to spit, urinate, or cause some other trouble. In short, over the years, Boy Ma's services came to resemble those of a real Durwan. Though under normal circumstances, this was no job for a woman. She honored the responsibility and maintained a vigil no less punctilious than if she were a gatekeeper of a house on a lower circular road, or a Jodhpur park, or any other fancy neighborhood. On the rooftop, Boy Ma hung her quilts over the clothesline. The wire, strung diagonally from one corner of the parapet to the other, stretched across her view of television antennas, billboards, and the distant arches of Hora Bridge. Boy Ma consulted the horizon on all four sides. Then she ran the tap at the base of the cistern. She washed her feet, rinsed her feet, and rubbed 2 fingers over her teeth. After this, she started to beat the quilts on each side with her broom. Every now and then, she stopped and squinted at the cement, hoping to identify the culprit of her sleepless nights. She was so absorbed in this process that it was some moments before she noticed Mrs. Dalal on the third floor, who had come to set a tray of salted lemon peels out to dry in the sun. "Whatever is inside this quilt is keeping me awake at night," Boy Ma said. "Tell me, where do you see them?" Mrs. Dalal had a soft spot for Boy Ma. Occasionally she gave the old woman some ginger paste with which to flavor her stews. "I don't see anything," Mrs. Dalal said after a while. "Then they must have wings," Boy Ma concluded. She put down her broom and observed one cloud passing behind another. "They fly away before I can squash them. But just see my back. I must be purple from their bites. Mrs. Dalal lifted the drape of Boy Ma's sari, a cheap white weave with a border the color of a dirty pond. She examined the skin above and below her blouse, cut in a style no longer sold in shops. Then she said, Boy Ma, you are imagining things. I tell you, these mites are eating me alive. It could be a case of prickly heat, Mrs. Dalal suggested. At this, Boy Ma shook the free end of her sari and made her skeleton keys rattle. She said, I know prickly heat. This is not prickly heat. I haven't slept in 3, perhaps 4 days. Who can count? I used to keep a clean bed. Our linens were muslin. Believe me, don't believe me. Our mosquito nets were as soft as silk. Such comforts you cannot even dream them. I cannot dream them, Mrs. Dalal echoed. She lowered her diaphanous eyelids and sighed. I cannot dream them, Boy Ma. I live in 2 broken rooms, married to a man who sells toilet parts. Mrs. Dalal turned away and looked at one of the quilts. She ran a finger over part of the stitching. Then she asked, Boy Ma, how long have you slept on this bedding? Boy Ma put a finger to her lips before replying that she could not remember. Then why no mention of it until today? Do you think it's beyond us to provide you with clean quilts? An oilcloth for that matter? She looked insulted. There is no need, Boy Ma said. They are clean now. I beat them with my broom. I am hearing no arguments, Mrs. Dalal said. You need a new bed, quilts, a pillow, a blanket when winter comes. As she spoke, Mrs. Dalal kept track of the necessary items by touching her thumb to the pads of her fingers. On festival days, the poor came to her house to be fed, Boy Ma said. She was filling a bucket from the coal heap on the other side of the roof. I will have a word with Mr. Dalal when he returns from the office, Mrs. Dalal called back as she headed down the stairs. Come in the afternoon. I will give you some pickles and some powder for your back. It's not prickly heat, Boy Ma said. It was true that prickly heat was common during the rainy season, but Boy Ma preferred to think that what irritated her bed, what stole her sleep, what burned like peppers across her thinning scalp and skin, was of a less mundane origin. She was ruminating on these things as she swept the stairwell. She always worked from top to bottom when it started to rain. It came slapping across the roof like a boy in slippers too big for him and washed Mrs. Dalal's lemon peels into the gutter. Before pedestrians could open their umbrellas, it rushed down collars, pockets, and shoes. In that particular flat building and all the neighboring buildings, creaky shutters were closed and tied with petticoat strings to the window bars. At that time, Boy Ma was working all the way down on the second-floor landing. She looked up the ladder-like stairs, and as the sound of falling water tightened around her, she knew her quilts were turning into yogurt. But then she recalled her conversation with Mrs. Dalal, and so she continued, at the same pace, to sweep the dust, cigarette ends, and lozenge wrappers from the rest of the steps, until she reached the letter boxes at the bottom. To keep out the wind, she rummaged through her baskets for some newspapers and crammed them into the diamond-shaped openings of the collapsible gate. Then on her bucket of coals, she set her lunch to boil, and monitored the flame with a plated palm fan. That afternoon, as was her habit, Boy Ma nodded her head, untied the loose end of her sari, and counted out her life savings. She had just woken up from a nap of 20 minutes, which she had taken on a temporary bed made from newspapers. The rain had stopped, and now the sour smell that rises from wet mango leaves was hanging low over the alley. On certain afternoons, Boy Ma visited her fellow residents. She enjoyed drifting in and out of their various households. The residents, for their part, assured Boy Ma that she was always welcome. They never drew the latch bars across their doors except at night. They went about their business, scolding children or adding up expenses or picking stones out of the evening rice. From time to time, she was handed a glass of tea. The cracker tin was passed in her direction, and she helped children shoot chips across the carom board. Knowing not to sit on the furniture, she crouched, instead, in the doorways and hallways, and observed gestures and manners in the same way a person tends to watch traffic in a foreign city. On this particular afternoon, Boy Ma decided to accept Mrs. Delal's invitation. Her back still itched, even after napping on the newspaper, and she was beginning to want some prickly heat powder after all. She picked up her broom. She never felt quite herself without it, and was about to climb upstairs, when a rickshaw pulled up to the collapsible gate. It was Mr. Delal. The years he had spent filing receipts had left him with purple crescents under his eyes. But today his gaze was bright. The tip of his tongue played between his teeth, and in the clamp of his thighs he held 2 small ceramic basins. "Boy Ma, I have a job for you. Help me carry these basins upstairs." He pressed a folded handkerchief to his forehead and throat and gave the rickshaw driver a coin. Then he and Boy Ma carried the basins all the way up to the 3rd floor. It wasn't until they were inside the flat that he finally announced, to Mrs. Delal, to Boy Ma, and to a few other residents who had followed them out of curiosity, the following things: that his hours filing receipts for a distributor of rubber tubes, pipes, and valve fittings had ended, that the distributor himself, who craved fresher air, and whose profits had doubled, was opening a 2nd branch in Durwan, and that, following an assessment of his sedulous performance over the years, the distributor was promoting Mr. Delal to manage the College Street branch. In his excitement on his way home through the plumbing district, Mr. Delal had bought 2 basins. "What are we supposed to do with 2 basins in a 2-room flat?" Mrs. Delal demanded. She had already been sulking over her lemon peels. "Who ever heard of it? I still cook on kerosene. You refused to apply for a phone, and I have yet to see the fridge you promised when we married. You expect 2 basins to make up for all that?" The argument that followed was loud enough to be heard all the way down to the letter boxes. It was loud enough and long enough to rise above a second spell of rain that fell after dark. It was loud enough even to distract Boy Ma as she swept the stairwell from top to bottom for the 2nd time that day, and for this reason she spoke neither of her hardships nor of easier times. She spent the night on a bed of newspapers. The argument between Mr. and Mrs. Delal was still more or less in effect early the next morning, when a barefoot team of workmen came to install the basins. After a night of tossing and pacing, Mr. Delal had decided to install one basin in the sitting room of their flat, and the other one in the stairwell of the building, on the 1st floor landing. "This way everyone can use it," he explained from door to door. The residents were delighted. For years they had all brushed their teeth with stored water poured from mugs. Mr. Delal, meanwhile, was thinking, a sink in the stairwell is sure to impress visitors. Now that he was a company manager, who could say who might visit the building? The workmen toiled for several hours. They ran up and down the stairs and ate their lunches squatting against the banister poles. They hammered, shouted, spat, and cursed. They wiped their sweat with the ends of their turbans. In general, they made it impossible for Boy Ma to sweep the stairwell that day. To occupy time, Boy Ma retired to the rooftop. She shuffled along the parapets, but her hips were sore from sleeping on newspapers. After consulting the horizon on all 4 sides, she tore what was left of her quilts into several strips and resolved to polish the banister poles at a later time. By early evening, the residents gathered to admire the day's labors. Even when Boy Ma was urged to rinse her hands under the clear running water, she sniffed. "Our bathwater was scented with petals and attars. Believe me, don't believe me. It was a luxury you cannot dream." Mr. Delal proceeded to demonstrate the basin's various features. He turned each faucet completely on and completely off. Then he turned on both faucets at the same time, to illustrate the difference in water pressure. Lifting a small lever between the faucets allowed water to collect in the basin, if desired. "The last word in elegance," Mr. Dalal concluded. "A sure sign of changing times," Mr. Chatterjee reputedly admitted from his balcony. Among the wives, however, resentment quickly brewed. Standing in line to brush their teeth in the mornings, each grew frustrated with having to wait her turn, for having to wipe the faucets after every use, and for not being able to leave her own soap and toothpaste tube on the basin's narrow periphery. The Dalals had their own sink. Why did the rest of them have to share it? "Is it beyond us to buy sinks of our own?" One of them finally burst out one morning. "Are the Dalals the only ones who can improve the conditions of this building?" asked another. Rumors began spreading that, following their argument, Mr. Dalal had consoled his wife by buying their 2 kilos of mustard oil, a cashmere shawl, a dozen cakes of sandalwood soap. That Mr. Dalal had filed an application for a telephone line. That Mrs. Dalal did nothing but wash her hands in her basin all day. As if this weren't enough, the next morning, a taxi bound for Howrah Station crammed its wheels into the alley. The Dalals were going to Simla for 10 days. "Boy Ma, I haven't forgotten. We will bring you back a sheep's hair blanket made in the mountains," Mrs. Dalal said through an open window of the taxi. She was holding a leather purse in her lap which matched the turquoise border of her sari. "We'll bring 2, cried Mr. Dalal, who was sitting beside his wife, checking his pockets to make sure his wallet was in place. Of all the people who lived in that particular flat building, Boy Ma was the only one who stood by the collapsible gate and wished them a safe journey. As soon as the Dalals were gone, the other wives began planning renovations of their own. One decided to barter a stack of her wedding bracelets and commissioned a whitewasher to freshen the walls of the stairwell. Another pawned her sewing machine and summoned an exterminator. A third went to the silversmith and sold back a set of pudding bowls. She intended to have the shutters painted yellow. Workers began to occupy this particular flat building night and day. To avoid the traffic, Boy Ma took to sleeping on the rooftop. So many people passed in and out of the collapsible gate, so many others clogged the alley at all times, that there was no point in keeping track of them. After a few days, Boy Ma moved her baskets and her cooking bucket to the rooftop as well. There was no need to use the basin downstairs, for she could as easily wash, as she always had, from the cistern tap. She still planned to polish the banister poles with the strips she had torn from her quilts. She continued to sleep on her newspapers. More rains came. Below the dripping awning, a newspaper pressed over her head. Boy Ma squatted and watched the monsoon ants as they marched along the clothesline, carrying eggs in their mouths. Damper winds soothed her back. Her newspapers were running low. Her mornings were long, her afternoons longer. She could not remember her last glass of tea, thinking neither of her hardships nor of earlier times. She wondered when the Dalals would return with her new bedding. She grew restless on the roof, and so for some exercise, Boy Ma started circling the neighborhood in the afternoons, reed broom in hand, sari smeared with newsprint ink. She wandered through markets and began spreading her life savings on small treats. Today a packet of puffed rice, tomorrow some cashews. The day after that, a cup of sugarcane juice. One day she walked as far as the bookstalls on College Street. The next day she walked even farther, to the produced markets in Bao Bazaar. It was there, while she was standing in a shopping arcade surveying jackfruits and persimmons, that she felt something tugging on the free end of her sari. When she looked, the rest of her life savings and her skeleton keys were gone. The residents were waiting for Boy Ma when she returned that afternoon at the collapsible gate. Baleful cries rang up and down the stairwell. all echoing the same news. The basin on the stairwell had been stolen. There was a big hole in the recently whitewashed wall, and a tangle of rubber tubes and pipes was sticking out of it. Chunks of plaster littered the landing. Boy Ma gripped her reed broom and said nothing. In their haste, the residents practically carried Boy Ma up the stairs to the roof, where they planted her on one side of the clothesline and started screaming at her from the other. "This is all her doing," one of them hollered, pointing at Boy Ma. "She informed the robbers. Where was she when she was supposed to guard the gate?" "For days she had been wandering the streets, speaking to strangers," another reported. "We shared our coal, gave her a place to sleep. How could she betray us this way?" a third wanted to know. Though none of them spoke directly to Boy Ma, she replied, believe me, I did not inform the robbers." "For years we have put up with your lies," they retorted. "Do you expect us, now, to believe you?" The recriminations persisted. How would they explain it to the Dalals? Eventually they sought the advice of Mr. Chatterjee. They found him sitting on his balcony, watching a traffic jam. One of the second-floor residents said, "Boy Ma has endangered the security of this building. We have valuables. The widow, Mrs. Misra, lives alone with her phone. What should we do?" Mr. Chatterjee considered their arguments. As he thought things over, he adjusted the shawl that was wrapped around his shoulders and gazed at the bamboo scaffolding that now surrounded his balcony. The shutters behind him, colorless for as long as he could remember, had been painted yellow. Finally he said, "Boy Ma's mouth is full of ashes, but that is nothing new. What is new is the face of this building. What a building like this needs is a real Durwan." So the residents tossed her bucket and rags, her baskets and reed broom, down the stairwell, past the letter boxes, through the collapsible gate, and into the alley. Then they tossed out Boy Ma. All were eager to begin their search for a real Durwan. From the pile of belongings, Boy Ma kept only her broom. Believe me, she said once more as her figure began to recede. She shook the free end of her sari, but nothing rattled. End of A Real Durwan by Jhumpa Lahiri. This is an audio production read by me, Jordan Barclay, just doing this because I want to. If you enjoyed the production of this video, feel free to hit that like button, I'd appreciate it. If you have any requests to what I should read next, comment below and I'll see if I can get to it as soon as possible. And if you want to be updated on these audio recordings, hit that subscribe button. I'd like it a lot. Alright guys, thanks for letting me do this. I'll see you soon. Until then, I'm out. Peace. Maybe I should do this with peace. Yeah, peace. Peace. I can do whatever. Peace. Bye.